with the core idea that the cycle that we're seeing today is very different than the cycles we've experienced over the course of our professional careers. And so they require the ability to sort of step back and really deeply understand not the fact that the dynamics that are driving them are unusual to us, but actually quite usual, quite common when you think about how business cycles and expansions have occurred, across countries, across time, which is that core idea of an income-led expansion has a lot of second and third order consequences when it comes to monetary policy, asset prices, what's likely to transpire with unemployment, inflation, et cetera. And so I think that's the main gap. And I see it all the time. I see it, for instance, if you read, what the Fed writes. Neil Kashkari came out with an essay that basically was like, I think monetary policy is tight, but growth doesn't seem to be slowing down. Somewhat confused, I think, by the cycle that we're seeing. And I think a lot of investors are confused by it. But if you reframe your thinking from credit-driven expansions or a fiscal-driven expansion to instead one that's a traditional income-driven expansion, it's going to be very, very helpful in framing and understanding what matters and what doesn't.
Okay, let me ask you one thing before you go, because it confuses me too, and I imagine it confuses a lot of folks, as you point out. So why do you think it is confusing? Like, where do you think, if you had to kind of pinpoint where that comes from or what that is, what do you think it is?
Well, I think the main thing that's confusing is we've had cycles where inevitably excesses emerge and where monetary policy is effective at curbing excesses. So if you think about like the 2006 to 2008, housing bubble driven cycle, right? We had huge credit growth, which got to a point where it was totally unsustainable. Like people were taking out greater than 100% LTV loans with no doc financing, that didn't have jobs. Like that's the sort of thing. You got to a point where there was so much debt creation that it was unsustainable, that it was going to continue. And you had a circumstance where the Fed's tightening, the raising of interest rates at that time was relatively effective in slowing that cycle because 50% of the loans were financed on the short end or were floating rate loans in one form or another. And so that's kind of our framework. That's the way of our thinking. But what's happening today is that there is essentially no credit creation occurring among households or businesses. There's not literally zero, but we're basically at recession-like levels of credit creation already, and yet the economy expands. And so that's the thing that's confusing, is that if you think about the economy through the lens of credit being the driver, and you think about the economy through the lens of money being the driver, right? Because in the post-GFC period, money creation went up and down and up and down, and that drove waves in asset prices in the macroeconomy. But again, what's happened in the post-COVID period is, in the last couple of years, is that asset prices are going up, the economy is strong, and money creation is negative, right? And so what that highlights is it's not money creation, it's not credit creation, it's something different. It's a different type of financing of an economic expansion, and it is in many ways the oldest type of financing of an economic expansion. If you just go back to periods where money supply was constant and where there weren't well-developed banks, how did you get business cycles? Well, someone started spending and they handed it to somebody and it was somebody's income, and that person started spending and they handed it to somebody and that was somebody's income. And that's not a spiral. I think too often people go, oh, well, you mean there's a spiral. It's not a spiral. It's just a self-reinforcing mechanism. It's not a spiral upwards or downwards. It's a reinforcing mechanism, a sustainable reinforcing mechanism that can continue for an extended period of time. And that's exactly what we're seeing, is not credit, not money, even the fiscal story, which really mattered right after COVID. We've had actually a fiscal contraction over the last 3 years. And nonetheless, we continue to see growth continue to plug along pretty well, and we continue to see asset prices rise. And it's all around that income point.
So I also take it no recession ahead, or at least not anytime soon.
Well, I think the main thing on that idea is in order to get, you have to ask yourself, what do you have to get in order to get a recession? And if it's not credit growth slowing down, and if it's not money growth slowing down, then what you have to do is you have to get that income growth that's happening. You have to get people to spend less of that income. And how does that work? Well, the way that they spend less of that income is they get scared. You get scared that you have to save more and spend less. And so how does that happen? Well, the key way that that happens is through asset prices falling. And so because, as long as asset prices are going up and you're earning a good wage, like, you keep spending. It's very natural that people just keep spending as long, if you're a middle class household, like, your house has gone up 100% in value in the last, 5 years. Your 401k is up, 50 to 100% in value in the last 5 years. Like, there's no reason to save, right? So the question is, what creates the incentive to save? And what creates the incentive to save is falling asset prices. And what creates falling asset prices in this environment is rising bond yields. And so that's when you talk about, when are we going to have a recession? We'll have a recession. It'll happen at some point. The question is really the ordering, which is, you start with long-term interest rates have to rise, and then that'll hurt asset prices, and then that'll hurt spending, and then that'll hurt earnings and incomes, and then that'll hurt employment, and then that'll start to slow wages, and then that will create a sustainable slowing of demand. But the path is in that direction, right? So the ordering matters. First, bond yields have to rise. Or, maybe there'll be an exogenous shock, but really, first, bond yields have to rise. That's the most, that's the most likely way in which this overall dynamic starts to slow. And we saw a taste of that last fall, but, bond yields touched 5 and then they went down, and there was a big easing that happened in response. And so we didn't really get that dynamic to play out long enough or high enough or painful enough to start to really shift what's going on with economic conditions. And so the question is not really when will a recession come? The question is much more what has to happen to get to the point of recession. And the first step of that is bond yields have to rise.